Here's the deal, Bill. Last summer, I asked WIP's Glen Macnow if you and I could, well, borrow his Tell Us Your Story segment, the one that he and Ray Didinger have been doing on WIP pretty much every weekend since last March. I asked if we could borrow that for a couple of segments, one with Ray and then one with Glenn. We did one several months back with Ray Diddy, and now we're happy to say it is Glenn's turn. So
with that, let's welcome Glen Macnow back to Philly Pressbox Radio. Glenn, welcome.
Hey, guys. Nice to see you.
You too.
Hello, Glenn. Thanks so much for doing this, man. So many Philly sports fans listen to you and Ray every weekend on WIP. I mean, it's appointment radio for me every weekend, but we figured not everybody knows how you ended up in Philly and the many other things that you are involved with. You're a very busy guy, so let's get to some of that. We'll cover as much ground as we possibly can. Sound good?
Sure. Ready to go.
All right. Here we go. Most people, Glenn, I'm sure know that you grew up in Buffalo. You've talked about that quite often. Is it true you were actually born in New York City? And at what age did you end up in Buffalo?
Yeah, I was born in New York City. My father worked on Madison Avenue. He was a young guy he was a graphic artist working for an ad agency. And when I was a newborn, they bought a house on Long Island. And my father would leave to go to work before his kids were awake and get home on the Long Island Railroad after his kids were asleep. And he decided that wasn't working for him and it wasn't working for us. He went to a job fair in New York and ended up getting a job in Buffalo, which, as somebody from New York, he had that myopia that he didn't know that New York State went beyond, say, Albany. Literally had to go look at a map, see where Buffalo was, but he liked the job, and we moved there when I was 3. So I spent all my childhood and formative years in Buffalo.
Well, Glenn, we're going to get to your father a little bit more because you've posted some recent stuff about him and the Bills this year. But as a kid growing up, obviously he was a sports fan. And is that where you got your love of sports as a kid?
You know, I made my father a fan more than he made me a fan. My dad was he was a boxing fan. So some of my earliest memories are that he would let me stay up late on Friday night to watch Gillette Cavalcade of Sports Boxing. Right. I'm like 5 years old, falling asleep on the couch. And he's like, encouraging me to watch the boxing with him. He was a baseball fan being from New York, but he wasn't a football fan. And when I was 7 years old, I turned on the TV and there was this football game and guys jumping all over each other. And it just seemed like the most magnificent thing. So I asked him and begged him to get tickets. We got tickets to go to my first Buffalo Bills game when I was 9, and he became a fan after that. I started playing hockey in my neighborhood when I was, 10, 11 years old. I dragged him to some Buffalo Sabre games. He became a fan after that. So I'm proud to say I made my father a fan more than he made me a fan.
Nice. So you ended up going to Boston University. I'm assuming you majored in journalism. Did you know as a teenager you wanted to do something in, sports writing or journalism?
No, actually, I started, like my father, I started out as an art student, and I got accepted to BU as an art student.
Oh, okay.
And originally went there for that. I switched when I was a freshman to be a film student. And then I realized that most people who graduated with a degree in film were starving. Not that journalists were doing that great, but it was also, I entered college back when it was the Watergate era, and it was the whole Woodward and Bernstein part was all very exciting and very sexy to me. I took a couple of courses in journalism, and I ended up graduating with a dual degree in journalism and history.
Interesting. So you took that and you headed to Florida, right? Got started in Florida with your first job. Yeah,
I had an internship in summer in college at a newspaper called the Niagara Falls Gazette near my hometown. And the editor of that paper ended up going down to Florida to work for the Gannett newspaper chain. And I reached out to him, and amazingly, newspapers were growing back then. They were hiring, they were growing, they were thriving. And I got my first newspaper job on a 75,000 circulation paper called Cocoa Beach Today, which became the model for USA Today, which started up about 10 years after that. And I got married right out of college and dragged my young bride to the middle of nowhere in Florida. But that's where we started. Then I went to the Fort Lauderdale News. I covered politics for the most part for them. I wrote special investigations. Didn't do any sports in those days. I was a news guy. And then I don't want to jump the story more than you want, but I ended up going to the Detroit Free Press from there.
Well, speaking of which, Glenn, and forgive me for showing this, but you had hair. You had hair, Glenn.
Yeah, look at that, man. Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty good while it lasted.
So what did you do in Detroit? What were you covering for the Free Press?
So I got hired to go to the Detroit Free Press originally as the education writer. I covered schools, city of Detroit public schools, suburban schools, colleges. I basically covered education for the whole state. It's kind of a statewide paper. So I did that. I liked it a lot. It was different from what I had done, but I really enjoyed the reporting on that. I went from that to being a political writer there. I covered a lot of campaigns for them, statewide, and some presidential stuff. And then I ended up being on a special projects team, and I kind of burned out on the hard news. I was writing a lot of depressing stories. I did a long investigation on sex criminals, which just really started to get into my mind. I did a long-term project on slumlords, and I needed a break. And the sports editor was a good friend of mine, a guy named Joe Distelheim. Actually, the poor guy just passed away a couple months ago. And I was just having coffee with him one day and telling him that, I'm really feeling burned out. And he said, I'll create a job for you in sports. Come on over to sports and we'll find something for you to do. So that's what I did.
Wow.
Nice.
Well, you mentioned your wife, your young wife at the time, Judy, and I have to ask you, I guess still young, and I guess you have a couple boys.
Look at that.
Look at that. Good-looking couple.
There you go. So I have to ask, Glenn, what was Judy thinking when you went from Fort Lauderdale to Detroit?
She felt it was closer to her home. It's funny. We lived in Florida. My wife's from Boston, and I'm from Buffalo. I met her in college in Boston, and we lived in Florida, but Florida never seemed the place that we would settle. It was really transient. It just didn't feel like home. I missed winter, believe it or not. Actually, I missed fall more than winter, but I missed seasons, and I think she felt the same way. Detroit was a bigger, better newspaper, and she knew that. And you know what? We spent 6 years in Detroit, and we really liked it. I know it's got such a bad reputation, but we bought our first house in Detroit. Our 2 kids were born in Detroit. We made a real go. She got a good job in Detroit. We made a real go of it. We liked it there. And
then in 1986, you ended up at the Philadelphia Inquirer covering sports business. How did that come about?
Well, that's what I did in Detroit. When I moved to sports, I didn't cover a team. I covered all the stuff in sports that none of the sports writers wanted to write about, the labor issues and the drug issues and the trials and all that, which I liked. I mean, that was the stuff that was the background where I came from. I was covering a trial in Pittsburgh in 1986. There was a guy, I remember the guy's name was Curtis Strong, and he was selling drugs. He was a clubhouse caterer, and he was selling drugs, cocaine, to a bunch of players in the clubhouse. He got busted, and then he gave out all the players' names, and it was Lonnie Smith and Keith Hernandez, and it was big stars in baseball. This is a big trial. If you ever cover a trial, you go in the first day, and wherever you sit is pretty much where you're going to sit throughout the whole thing. I think it was like a 2-week trial. I sat next to a woman who wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Her name was Lucinda Fleeson, great name. And so I sat next to her the second day, and I think we went out to lunch, and you kind of strike up this short-term friendship when you're both covering the same assignment. I went back to Detroit. She told the editor of the Inquirer about me, and a few months later, actually 2 days after my son was born and 3 days after we moved into a new house, the Philadelphia Inquirer called me and ended up offering me a job. The timing couldn't have been worse, but I'm thrilled it all worked out.
It always seems to work out that way, doesn't it? Well, so you're there for just, I guess it's 7 years. If we have our numbers right, 7 years later, you are voted or named the best sports writer in Philadelphia by Philadelphia Magazine. You come a long way in a short time.
The fix was in. I bribed those guys.
And then right after that, you leave the Inquirer and you go to WIP. You've spoken often about your respect for Angelo Cataldi, the job he does. You mentioned Tom Bigby, who just recently passed. Tough guy to work for, but very successful. So tell us about your decision to leave the paper and go to radio.
So the way that came about was this. When we were at the Inquirer, I'm watching cable one night. I forget what channel it was. And there was a show from Chicago called Sports Writers on TV, which was a bunch of old Chicago Tribune sports writers sitting around a table talking sports. This is before ESPN did. This is before anybody did it. And I thought, we could do that. And so I got together Angelo and Al and Jason Stark, and we went to Prism, and we convinced them that we could do a TV show, which became the Great Sports Debate. So we're doing that, and it's a lot of fun, and it's just for Jack there. Hey, nice work. Boy,
and look at that guy on the right. We won't talk about the guy on the right.
Well, whatever. But yeah, so there it is. There's me in my youth. WIP starts up, and Al Morganti goes to WIP, and I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Al Morganti goes to WIP and says, you guys need programming. How about we do a 1-hour show every morning where we'll have a bunch of guys from the Inquirer just kind of rotate in and do the show. It became clear quick enough that Angelo was the best of the four of us. I mean, he just had a natural talent for it. But he did it, I did it, Jason Stark did it, Mike Missinelli. We just kind of, it would be two of us a day, and I would have 2 days one week and 3 days the next. When WIP started to grow, and the guy you mentioned, Tom Bigby, got in charge, he knew he had something there. And what he knew was sports talk radio was a fairly new medium. 24-hour was. There was always sports talk on the radio. But the guys who wrote for the newspaper had two things that they could do. They could tell a story, because that was what we all did. We wrote stories every week. We could tell a story. And we had some degree of credibility because we were out there. We were in locker rooms. We interviewed people. We kind of had established ourselves. We weren't some guy just walking off the street saying, I can do radio. So one by one, he brought us over. First, Angelo, who did the show with Tom Brookshire, the morning show. Angelo's still doing that show 30, however many years later.
Yeah.
Then he brought over Al Morganti to be Al's sidekick, to Angelo's sidekick, and Al's brilliant at it, always has been. Mike Missinelli went over. And then they wanted to, Jody McDonald was doing the show by himself after Bill Campbell retired, and they wanted it to be a two-man show. And so I got the offer, which was a really good time for me to get the offer, because having done newspaper writing for 15 years, I was really ready for a career switch. It came for me at a really good time.
Well, I have to ask you, even though we're going to get to this a little bit later in some more detail, anywhere in the back of your head at this point, was there beer?
Oh, only in the fridge.
I saw you sipping on that. Yeah. And I thought, well, I wonder at what part of this story did beer come into play?
So this is the lighting's not great. Conchock and Brewing Company, heaps of green tonight. So yeah, no, I've always been a beer drinker, but back in the 90s, it wasn't even a dream in my mind. I didn't have enough money to lose back then.
All right. So at WIP, you did team up with Jody McDonald, Mac and Mac. You partnered with Anthony Gargano for a bit. You worked evenings for a while. You did a great segment on there that I remember, the Movie Club for Men, which I guess led to some of your books. This great book right here, the book of sports movies, a terrific piece. I think I've seen only about 45 out of the 100 movies in there. I got to get on the stick and get moving.
I mean, the whole point of that book was to get people to see more of those movies.
I just watched The Sandlot and The Bad News Bears, the original, in the last 2 years. So I'm getting there slowly.
Okay. Good.
But in the early 2000s, you teamed up with this guy, Ray Didinger. And I don't think either of you know exactly when it started. I've seen 2002, I've seen 2003, I've seen 2004, but at some point you guys teamed up and really hit it off. And you explained before, but it's like two guys sitting there talking about sports. How is that so successful?
Because it's not work.
Yeah.
It's so the way that show started was I was doing drive time afternoons with Anthony Gargano, and the station needed to make a switch, not so much to our show, but because Howard Eskin and Mike Missinelli were working together and somebody was going to die. And so they needed to break up that pair. And in breaking up that pair, they kind of shifted around a lot of shows, and they put Mike Missinelli on with Anthony, which meant they had to find something for me, so they put me on in the evenings, which was fine. I actually enjoyed it a lot. It was a good show. I got really good callers. Smart guys driving home is the way I would describe my callers on that show. But it also meant I had to work one weekend day. And I got to choose. Tom Bigby was the program director. I think he felt bad for me. And he said, listen, you choose whatever shift you want to work on the weekend, and that's fine. So I said, I'll work with Ray. I knew Ray a little bit from when I was a newspaper guy. We covered some stories together. I mean, we weren't friends, but we were friendly. And I just knew what a treasure he was. And so that part was easy, wanting to work with Ray. The chemistry part, and I agree with you, we really do have a natural chemistry, and it's in part because we're friends, but I think the friendship has grown out of the chemistry as much as the other way around. I don't know that I can deeply analyze it except to say I never feel like it's work, and I never feel the sense, and you get this in radio, what are we going to talk about in the next segment? What if this doesn't work? What are we going to do? How do we attract calls? And so I don't worry about it. I just, for Ray, well, he doesn't drink coffee either, but for Ray, it's getting together over a bar stool with a Diet Coke in your hands. And for me, it's one of these, or in the morning, a cup of coffee. And we just go. Listen, I do put a lot of planning into the show.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like we just, radio is not as easy as you just turn on your microphone and you go. Although that's what it's supposed to sound like. When you're doing it right, that's what the listener is supposed to think. But I put a lot of planning into what we're going to do, and then I let Ray be the smart guy.
Well, and I can tell you, Glenn, from being a listener and a fan of the show, it sounds exactly like that. It sounds like a couple guys sitting around drinking a couple cold beers. And as a fan, we feel like we could sit there with you guys doing the same thing. That's across as a fan.
Yeah, and that's the whole idea, is that, as you said so well, it's a couple guys sitting around drinking beer. And as a listener, you're invited to eavesdrop, or if you want to add to the conversation, you're invited to call. We probably don't take as many calls as other shows. Part of that is because we're only on twice a week for 3 hours, so we got a lot we got to get in. But we appreciate how the audience responds.
Getting back to the books, you've authored or co-authored numerous books, several children's books even, which I wasn't really aware of. Sports books like The Great Philadelphia Fan Book with Anthony, The Great Philadelphia Sports Debate with Anthony or Angelo Cataldi, and The Great Book of Philadelphia Sports Lists, another one that I happen to have right here, autographed by you personally.
Yeah, but you got the old one. Hold on. You got to get the new one. I got one of them here somewhere. Yeah, you got to get the new edition that Big Daddy and I did right at the end of right before the pandemic, right at the end of 2018.
I do need the new one. That is correct. Any new books in the works? You got anything coming up?
Here's the shame of it. It's harder and harder to sell books these days. The one with Big Daddy was nice because the publisher approached us. They could just said, we like this book that you guys did in 2006. Just redo the thing. And that was easy and that was fun. I wanted to do another movie book. And in fact, I had a partner on it, the film critic Carrie Rickey, who was so good for the Inquirer for so many years. And she and I wanted to write, catch this, the ultimate book of romantic comedies. Not my usual lane, but I like good movies, and I thought that would sell. We got a couple publishers to nibble, but we never really got an offer that would make it worth writing, and so we didn't. So I don't know the next time I'm going to write a book. It's a shame because I enjoy it, but I don't see it in the short term.
Well, Glenn, tell us about the annual food hunt. Obviously, it didn't go too well with the pandemic this year, but how did the food hunt come about? And tell us about that.
So the food hunt came about the same way another feature I used to do called the Movie Club for Men, which the sports movie book was an outgrowth of that. When I moved from afternoons to nights at WIP in the mid 2000s, I realized that I'm on against the Phillies in the summer, and I got to counter program something because I'm going to lose a lot of listeners to the Phillies. Fortunately for me, this is when the Phillies were no good. So, there were a good number of losing seasons back then. I think it started with the Terry Francona era, but I realized I got to be creative or I'm not going to get anything going. So I think it started just one night. I'm talking about pizza, right? And I'm saying, I got this treasure of a pizza place near me. And, everybody's got their favorite pizza place. And it was really just a throwaway. But all of a sudden, boom, 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 the lines start lighting up. And people say, and somebody says, like, if you don't eat at this slice pizza in South Philly, you're crazy. And somebody else said something else. Actually, I lied. It wasn't pizza. It was ribs. It was ribs. That was the first one. I'm talking about ribs. And I realized, like, I got something there. And I got to do something with this. So I just decided I'm going to find the best ribs in the Delaware Valley. And you're going to help me, you being the audience. And this is really before a lot of social media. I think I had a small presence on Facebook, but it's before that. But boy, I got so many shows out of that. And then I probably went to four. I would send my interns out to pick up ribs during the show. And then WIP had the Flyers game in those days, and I would be on before the game and between periods. And so the interns would come back. We'd eat the ribs during the first period. I'd do the intermission. And then the next day when there was no Flyers, I would talk about the ribs. They pay me for this nonsense. And we did a rib final that year, and Ray was a judge, and the late, great John Chaney was a judge, and Bernie Perrant was a judge. And shockingly, it's not really hard. I got a couple. I think Todd Harriman's was one of my judges. It's not hard to get people to come to the studio when you say you're going to give them free ribs. George Perrier, the owner of Lebec Fan, was a judge, and he brought like these $200 bottles of wine, which were all guzzling and eating ribs, and it was great. And so I did that, and then I thought, okay, next year let's do another. Became pizza. After about 2 or 3 years, WIP's program director at the time was a guy named Andy Bloom, and he said, "This is good, but we got to make this a public event. We got to take this out of the studio." So the first one we did publicly was the time I did cheesesteaks. I never wanted to do cheesesteaks because everybody did them, but one year I did cheesesteaks, and there was a place down on South Street, and we said, everybody come, you got free cheesesteaks, and we got the celebrity judges. We did the show from there. I thought we'd get 50 people. We got like 600 people, and from there it grew and it grew and it grew, and it became an annual thing. I pick a different food every year. I didn't get to do it last year because of the pandemic. I literally had just started. I had gone to one restaurant before the pandemic shut it down. Depending on how things are this year, maybe I could do it in the summer. I don't know. I would love to get back to it.
And what goes good with food? Beer. You're part owner of the Conshohocken Brewing Company. You do a TV show with Joe Sixpack. What's Brewing? There you guys are enjoying a couple of beverages. You have a good life, Glenn. How'd you get involved in the ownership of the brewery?
So I have a friend. I'll give him a plug. His name is Andy Rosen. He's a dentist. Been a buddy of mine since our kids were 4-year-olds together, which is how I met him. And like me, he's a beer guy. He's a more high-level beer guy than I am. But we'd go out for beers, and he'd always say, like, you know what? Someday we're going to start our own place. And I'd say, like, okay, good. Next round's on you. And then we go out 6 months later and say, you know what? Someday we're gonna start our own brewery. And I'd say, okay, you're crazy. And then one time we went out. I remember where we were. We were at a place in Media called Quotations, good beer bar. And Andy says, guess what? We're going to start our own brewery. I found the guys. I found a good chunk of money. That was important. I certainly didn't have enough money to do it myself. I found people who know how to run a business. Let's do it. I was pretty skeptical. I figured there are a lot of good ways to lose my money, and I don't know that I needed another. But we met with some really sharp people who knew about making beer, selling beer, starting a restaurant. And there were about a dozen of us, and we bought in. I figured if nothing else, kind of like the Cheers thing, I always had a spot at the bar, always had an empty stool ready for me, if nothing else. And we started with one place in Conshohocken. That was in 2013, and we've built it up to 5 really solid restaurants, brew pubs, and we built a new brewing facility last year that tripled our capacity. We're adding cans all over the Delaware Valley. We're looking to expand. We're in Delaware now, and listen, times are tough for everybody in the business, but we're doing okay, and we appreciate it.
Well, one thing you can get from your story as you're telling us your story is you have a keen eye, certainly for business and through your career. So let's take that over to the sports side. Favorite players, guys that your keen eye liked as you've covered Philly sports for years?
Well, it's going to be not a lot of guys out of the box. Reggie White was one of my favorite people ever to deal with. I came to the Inquirer right when the NFL shut down in 1987, and I covered that strike, and Reggie was the guy for the players, and Reggie was a treasure to talk to. I really liked him as a person, and I really liked him as a source. Not that he would give me stuff that he wasn't supposed to give me, but just he was always available, and he would always tell me the truth. So I always liked him. I loved Charles Barkley. Charles was refreshingly honest. And, the thing about Charles, there are a lot of people in sport everywhere who try to convince you they're a good guy, but they're actually kind of a jerk. Charles was almost the opposite of that. Charles was a guy who he was brash and he was loud and he made a couple of mistakes and people think he's a jerk, but Charles was the nicest person. I'll give you 2 quick Charles stories that tell you why he's my favorite. Used to be a restaurant out on Lancaster Avenue in the main line called Al E. Gators. And
I was there.
Okay, you know the place.
Charles did a show there for a while.
Is that right?
Yeah, he did a show there.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I thought you said you did a show. Yeah, Charles did a show
Charles.
there for a while. Yeah, so it was a place you could bring your family, and it was also a place that had a decent bar and so on. And I'm there one time with my wife, and I knew Charles, but he didn't see me there. There's a woman there with a table full of 8-year-olds, and one's having a birthday party. And the woman comes up. Charles is at the bar with his wife, a couple of friends. The woman comes up. She's very respectful. She says, "Charles, it's my son's birthday. If you could just come over and say hi to the kids, I just know they'd be so thrilled." And Barkley goes, "Where is this boy? What's going on?" He starts being really loud and funny. And he goes over to the table. And he's like, "Who's the birthday boy?" And he gives the kid noogies. And he sits down at the table, and I tell you, 20 minutes later, he's got one of those pointy hats on, and he's singing, and all these 8-year-old boys are like, right? And meanwhile, Charles' wife is back at the bar, like, is he coming back? But it just was such a lovely thing to do, and I know those kids who are now, whatever, in their mid-20s probably still remember it. Other story, I'm in Atlanta. No, I'm in New Orleans, covering the NCAA finals one year. WIP sent us down there, Anthony Gargano and I, for the NCAA finals. Very cool. And it's the airport coming home. And turns out Charles Barkley's in the same gate as I am. And a woman comes up to him and says, Charles is talking to Jim Gray and Kenny Smith. Right. And they're just, passing on, waiting for the plane. A woman comes up again, very polite, older woman, right? Probably 70 years old, recognized him and says, Charles, I just, again, if I could get your autograph. And he goes, "So what's your name?" And she goes, Phyllis. And he goes, "Where are you from?" She goes, "Omaha." He said, "So Phyllis from Omaha, Jim Gray and I are having this argument. And he says this, and I want to know what you think. And she goes, okay. And obviously now Charles Barkley is holding court in an airport terminal, so everybody's coming over, right, to see what's going on. And Barkley, who doesn't have to be bothered by anybody, is pulling everybody in. And he's saying, yeah, that's what I think. Sir, you. And he just some random guy like, what do you think? And he's just the nicest guy. So those would be two of my absolute favorites.
Awesome. All right, we're just about out of time, Glenn. A couple of things we didn't mention. You were inducted into the Philadelphia Jewish Sports Hall of Fame in 2016. Congratulations on that. We mentioned your dad, Marv. Here's a picture of Marv a couple of years ago.
There's my
the
dad.
Bills fan. Hopefully he'll stick around for a lot more years and get to see that Bills Super Bowl title. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. They got a real quarterback. And Glenn, the whole basis of this thing with you, our little tell us your story thing, is what you and Ray have been doing since last March. When the pandemic hit, you and Ray have been doing your weekly Tell Us Your Story. Your guests have included guys like George Foreman, Jimmy Rollins, Larry Anderson, Jay Wright, Jeremy Roenick, Eric Allen, Dick Vermeil, Billy Cunningham. Pretty impressive lineup, and you got another great one this weekend, don't you?
We do. We decided for the Super Bowl, we needed to get a great football guest. So on Saturday at noon, Brian Dawkins will be our guest on Tell Us Your Story. I can promise that's going to be a great one.
I'm sure.
Absolutely. Well, by the way, Glenn, who's going to win the Super Bowl?
I think the Chiefs are going to win it going away. I hope it's a close game. As a Philadelphian, I can't root for Tom Brady, that's for sure. And I got a bit of a soft spot for Andy, so I think the Chiefs will win, and I certainly think they'll win by at least a touchdown.
Good, since I may have wagered some money on that happening. Final question. Your initial impression of this guy, Nick Sirianni, the new Eagles coach.
Very nervous, very young. I hope he can command a room full of players. I don't know that. He comes recommended by a lot of good people. So wait and see. I'll tell you the biggest concern I have, and I'll give it to you quick, is I don't mind a young coach, and he's a young coach. Dick Vermeil was a young coach and succeeded. Andy Reid was a young coach and succeeded. But both Dick Vermeil and Andy Reid had a couple of older guys on their staff. Mm-hmm. Dick Vermeil had a guy named Sid Gilman, who was a real guru of the passing game. Andy Reid had Jim Johnson. I worry this entire staff is a bunch of guys in their 30s and 20s, and I just feel like I would prefer if there was somebody who'd been there before who could tell him what he doesn't know. That's my biggest concern.
I'm with you.
One final question from me. Sixers are in first place. Flyers are in first place. Somebody going to win a championship here in 2021?
Sure. I've only said yes for the last 20 years, and I've been right twice. So why not again?
Oh,
sounds good.
All right, Glenn. Well, hey, thanks a lot for doing this. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We enjoyed the heck out of it, and glad you took the time to do it with us.
Thanks. You guys have a great show. Thanks so much. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you, Glenn.